The winter of 1878 arrived in Montana Territory like an unwelcome visitor, 3 weeks ahead of schedule and carrying the kind of cold that settled deep into a man's bones. Samuel Garrett stood at the window of his cabin, watching thick snowflakes drift past the glass in the pale afternoon light. His calloused fingers traced the frost patterns that had formed overnight, each delicate crystal a reminder of how quickly beauty could turn deadly in this unforgiving land. Behind him, the fire crackled in the stone hearth he had built with his own hands 8 years ago, back when hope still lived in this place. The cabin felt larger now than it had any right to, every corner echoing with memories he tried not to disturb. On the mantel above the flames sat a tintype photograph in a simple wooden frame. Mary and Thomas smiled back at him from that frozen moment, captured just months before the influenza epidemic swept through the territory like wildfire through dry grass. Samuel picked up the photograph, his thumb brushing across the glass that protected their faces from time. Mary had been holding Thomas on her lap, the boy's small hands wrapped around a wooden horse Samuel had carved for his 5th birthday. The horse now sat on a shelf beside the boy's bed, gathering dust in a room that had remained untouched since the day they buried him next to his mother on the hill overlooking the Yellowstone River. "Should have been me," Samuel whispered to the empty room, the words forming clouds of vapor in the cooling air. The fire needed another log, but he couldn't bring himself to move away from the window. Outside, his cattle stood huddled together in the near pasture, their backs dusted white with snow. 200 head of prime beef, the result of 7 years of back-breaking work, worth more than most men saw in a lifetime. Yet the sight of them brought him no satisfaction, only the hollow ache of purpose without meaning. The ranch sprawled across 1,500 acres of some of the finest grazing land in the territory, bordered by a tributary of the Yellowstone that never ran dry. Water rights alone made the property valuable beyond measure, especially with talk of the railroad finally pushing west through Montana. Samuel had built something lasting here, something a man could be proud to pass down to his son. But Thomas was gone, and Mary with him, and the legacy he had sweated to create felt as empty as the wind that howled through the mountain passes. Samuel set the photograph back on the mantel and walked to the heavy wooden door. The brass handle was cold enough to burn his palm, but he pushed outside anyway, pulling his sheepskin coat tight against the wind. The storm had been building since dawn, and he needed to check the fence line along the eastern pasture before the weather turned worse. Cattle had a way of wandering when storms made them restless, and losing even one head to wolves or the elements was money he couldn't afford to waste. His boots crunched through snow that already reached his ankles. The flakes fell fat and heavy, the kind that meant serious accumulation before the storm passed. His breath formed white clouds that were snatched away by the wind before they could fully form. In the distance, the peaks of the Absaroka Range disappeared into low-hanging clouds, their familiar outlines erased by the approaching blizzard. Samuel had learned to read weather the hard way during his years in the cavalry, when a mistaken judgment could mean death for an entire company of men. The storm moving down from the northwest carried the particular weight and smell that promised at least 2 feet of snow before it finished. Early winter storms were the most dangerous because they caught both man and beast unprepared. He walked the fence line with practiced efficiency, checking each post and wire for signs of damage or wear. The work was methodical, almost meditative, requiring enough attention to keep his mind from wandering to darker places. At each corner post, he stopped to examine the wire tension and the condition of the wooden supports. A broken fence meant scattered cattle, and scattered cattle meant financial ruin. The eastern boundary ran along a ridge that offered a view of the valley below, where the Crow Agency buildings sat like small brown dots against the white landscape. Relations with the Crow had been peaceful since the Treaty of 1868, but tensions still ran high throughout the territory. Just 2 years ago, Custer and his men had died at Little Bighorn, less than 100 miles southeast of where Samuel now stood. The memory of that day still woke him some nights, not because he had been there, but because he should have been. Samuel had served under Colonel Gibbon in the Montana Column, part of the 3-pronged attack that was supposed to trap the Sioux and Cheyenne in a coordinated assault. But Gibbon's forces had arrived a day late to the battlefield, finding only the scattered remains of the 7th Cavalry and the stench of death hanging over the Little Bighorn River. Samuel still carried the scar on his left hand where a piece of shrapnel from a burning wagon had cut him during the cleanup that followed. The war had ended his military career, but not by choice. A man could only see so much death before something inside him broke, and Samuel had reached that point kneeling beside the body of his best friend, Lieutenant William Hayes, whose scalped corpse lay twisted in the grass beside the river. The army doctors called it nervous exhaustion. Samuel called it the weight of too many ghosts. He had come to Montana to forget, bringing Mary and Thomas to build a new life far from the battlefields and the memories that followed him like shadows. For 3 years it had worked. The ranch had prospered, Thomas had grown strong and curious about everything around him, and Mary had filled the cabin with laughter and the smell of fresh bread. Then the traders had come through in the spring of 1871, carrying blankets and supplies to trade with the local tribes. What they also carried was influenza, though they either didn't know or didn't care about the death they were spreading. The epidemic had moved through the territory like a plague from the Old Testament, killing indiscriminately. Thomas had been the first to fall sick in their household, developing a fever that climbed so high he spoke to people who weren't there. Mary had nursed him for 6 days before she began showing symptoms herself. Samuel had ridden to Helena through a spring blizzard to find a doctor, but by the time they returned, both his wife and son were beyond any earthly help. The memory of their burial still haunted him. He had dug the graves himself, working through frozen ground that fought him with every shovelful of earth. The preacher from Red Lodge had spoken words about God's plan and eternal rest, but Samuel had stopped listening after the first sentence. If this was God's plan, then God was either cruel or absent, and neither possibility offered much comfort to a man standing over the graves of his family. Now 7 years later, Samuel continued the work because work was all that remained. The ranch provided purpose without passion, routine without joy. He had received offers to sell the land, generous offers that would let him start over somewhere else. But leaving would mean abandoning the graves on the hill and the memories that lived in every corner of the cabin. So he stayed, tending cattle and mending fences and marking time until his own turn came to rest beside Mary and Thomas on the hill. The wind picked up as Samuel reached the far corner of the eastern pasture, driving snow into his eyes and making the world disappear beyond 20 feet in any direction. He turned to head back toward the cabin when something caught his attention near a cluster of boulders that marked the old boundary line. A dark shape lay crumpled against the largest rock, partially hidden by the swirling snow. Samuel's first thought was that one of his cattle had wandered off and succumbed to the cold, but as he approached, the shape resolved into something far more troubling. It was a person curled tight against the stone with their back to the wind, covered in a thin blanket that offered little protection against the storm. He broke into a run, his boots slipping on the snow-covered rocks. The figure was small, much smaller than any of the cowhands who worked the neighboring ranches. As Samuel knelt beside them, he could see it was a woman, her long black hair whipped around her face by the wind. Her skin had the bronze tone of someone born under desert sun, but the cold had drained most of the color from her features. She wore a dress of soft deerskin decorated with small glass beads, now torn and stained with blood. Her breathing was shallow and irregular, the kind of pattern Samuel had seen too many times on battlefields. Hypothermia was setting in, and without immediate warmth, she would be dead within the hour. He pulled off his heavy coat and wrapped it around her before lifting her carefully in his arms. She weighed almost nothing, like holding a child or a bundle of sticks. As Samuel stood, cradling the unconscious woman against his chest, he noticed something that made his blood run cold. The snow around the boulder was trampled with hoof prints, but not the unshod prints of Indian ponies. These were the deep, circular impressions left by cavalry horses, the kind that wore iron shoes forged in military smithies. Someone had been here recently, someone who rode with the precision and equipment of professional soldiers. Samuel scanned the surrounding area as best he could through the driving snow. The tracks formed a rough circle around the boulder, as if riders had surrounded the woman before leaving her here to die. Boot prints in the snow showed where at least 3 men had dismounted, and Samuel could see the deeper impressions where they had struggled with something or someone. Dark stains in the snow near the boulder could have been blood, though the falling snow was quickly covering any evidence. The woman in his arms stirred slightly, her head rolling against his shoulder. Even unconscious, she clutched something tightly in her right hand. Samuel could see the corner of what appeared to be a piece of paper or parchment, crumpled and stained, but clearly important enough for her to hold on to even in her desperate condition. Samuel made the decision quickly. Questions could wait until the woman was safe and warm. He adjusted his grip on her and began the trek back to the cabin, fighting against wind that seemed determined to push him backward with each step. The storm was worsening, and even his familiar landmarks were becoming difficult to distinguish through the curtain of snow. The journey back felt endless. Samuel's arms ached from carrying the woman, and his feet grew numb despite his heavy boots. More than once he stumbled on hidden rocks or holes in the ground, fighting to keep his balance without dropping his burden. The woman's breathing remained shallow, and several times he thought she had stopped breathing entirely until a faint puff of vapor from her lips reassured him. By the time Samuel reached the cabin, his hands were so cold he could barely work the door latch. He managed to get inside and immediately carried the woman to the bed in the small room that had once belonged to Thomas. The room was cold, unused for months, but it would warm quickly once he got the fire in the main room built up. Samuel laid the woman carefully on the bed and covered her with every blanket he could find. Her skin was pale and cold to the touch, her lips tinged with blue. He had seen enough cases of severe exposure to know she was in serious danger. The next few hours would determine whether she lived or died. He built up the fire until flames roared in the hearth, then hauled in armloads of split wood to keep it burning hot through the night. The cabin began to warm, but slowly, the thick log walls holding the cold like a grudge. Samuel heated water in his largest pot and prepared clean cloths for washing her wounds. The medical supplies he kept for treating injured livestock would have to serve for human medicine. As the woman began to warm, Samuel could see the extent of her injuries more clearly. Besides the obvious effects of exposure, she had a deep gash along her right temple and what appeared to be rope burns around her wrists. Her dress was torn in several places, and dark bruises marked her arms and shoulders. Someone had hurt her badly before leaving her to die in the storm. The piece of paper she had been clutching so tightly turned out to be a page torn from what looked like an official document. The ink had run from snow and moisture, making most of the text illegible, but Samuel could make out fragments of words: survey, route, and what might have been railroad. The paper felt expensive, the kind used for legal documents or government correspondence. Samuel folded the paper carefully and placed it on the table beside the bed. Whatever secrets it contained would have to wait until the woman was conscious enough to explain them. For now, keeping her alive was his only concern. He tended the fire through the afternoon and into the evening, checking on the woman every few minutes. Her color gradually improved as warmth returned to her body, but she remained unconscious, occasionally murmuring words in what sounded like Apache. Samuel had learned enough of the language during his cavalry days to recognize it, though he couldn't understand what she was saying. As night fell and the storm continued to rage outside, Samuel settled into the chair beside the bed to keep watch. The woman's breathing had steadied and some of the blue tinge had left her lips, but she was far from safe. Severe exposure could cause complications that didn't appear for days, and her other injuries suggested violence that might have deeper consequences than what showed on the surface. Samuel found himself studying her face in the firelight. She was young, probably no more than 25, with high cheekbones and strong features that spoke of mixed heritage. Her hands, when he had cleaned and bandaged her wounds, were small but calloused from hard work. This was not some pampered trader's daughter or reservation agency employee. She was someone who lived close to the land, someone who knew hardship and survival. The storm outside howled with renewed fury, shaking the cabin's walls and driving snow against the windows like thrown sand. Samuel was grateful he had found her when he did. Another hour in those conditions would have killed her, and come spring, all that would have been left was bones scattered by wolves and weather. Around midnight, the woman began to stir. Her eyes fluttered open, dark brown and filled with confusion and fear. She tried to sit up quickly, then gasped in pain and fell back against the pillow. Her gaze darted around the unfamiliar room before settling on Samuel, who sat perfectly still in his chair, hands visible and unthreatening. "Easy now," Samuel said quietly, keeping his voice low and calm. "You're safe. I found you in the storm." The woman's eyes narrowed, studying his face with the intensity of someone who had learned to judge character quickly and accurately. She tried to speak, but only a harsh croak emerged from her throat. Samuel reached for the cup of water he had prepared and held it toward her. "Just water," he said. "You need it." She hesitated, then allowed him to help her drink. The water seemed to help, and when she spoke again, her voice was weak but clear. "Where am I?" she asked, her English accented but precise. "My ranch, about 10 miles east of Red Lodge," Samuel replied. "I'm Samuel Garrett. I found you near the Boundary Rocks during the storm." The woman's expression tightened at the mention of the Boundary Rocks. "How long have I been here?" "Since this afternoon. You were nearly frozen when I found you." She struggled to sit up again, this time moving more carefully. "I have to go. They'll come looking." "No one's going anywhere in this storm," Samuel said firmly. "It's been blowing hard for hours, and it's not letting up anytime soon. Besides, you're in no condition to travel." The woman looked toward the window, where snow continued to streak past the glass. The wind had not diminished, and even through the thick walls, they could hear its constant moan. She seemed to deflate slightly, accepting the reality of her situation. "My name is Ayana," she said finally. "I thank you for your kindness, but my presence here brings danger." "What kind of danger?" Ayana hesitated, her hand moving unconsciously to where the paper had been. "Men were chasing me, white men on cavalry horses. They caught me this morning." Samuel felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. "What did they want?" "Information," Ayana said, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Information I overheard that could cost them a great deal of money." Before Samuel could ask for details, Ayana's eyes rolled back and she slumped against the pillow, unconscious again. Samuel checked her pulse and found it steady but weak. The effort of talking had exhausted her remaining strength. Samuel spent the rest of the night keeping watch, adding wood to the fire and monitoring Ayana's condition. Outside, the storm continued with unrelenting fury, but inside the cabin, warmth and safety held back the cold and darkness. As dawn approached, the wind finally began to diminish, though snow continued to fall steadily. When morning light filtered through the windows, Samuel could see the full extent of the storm's impact. Snow had drifted against the cabin walls nearly to the windowsills, and the world beyond was transformed into an unbroken expanse of white. His cattle would be huddled in whatever shelter they could find, waiting out the weather like every other living thing in the territory. Ayana woke again near midday, this time more alert and aware of her surroundings. Samuel had prepared a simple meal of beef broth and bread, and she accepted it gratefully. Color was returning to her cheeks, and some of the wariness had left her eyes, though she still watched Samuel carefully. "The paper," she said suddenly. "Where is the paper I was holding?" Samuel retrieved the damaged document from the table and handed it to her. Ayana unfolded it carefully, studying the water-stained text with growing concern. "Can you read it?" Samuel asked. "Some of it," Ayana replied. "Enough to understand what it means." She looked up at Samuel with haunted eyes. "This is a survey report for a railroad route. They plan to run tracks through the sacred valley where my mother's people hold their winter ceremonies." Samuel felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to fall into place. "That's why they were chasing you? Because you saw this?" Ayana nodded grimly. "I was working as a translator for the Indian agency when these men arrived. They thought I couldn't understand English well enough to follow their conversation. They were wrong." "What did you hear?" "Plans to remove the Apache from their winter grounds by claiming the land for railroad development. But it's not just about the railroad. There's something else, something valuable hidden in those hills." Samuel waited for her to continue, but Ayana had fallen silent, staring at the paper with an expression of deep worry. Outside, the storm was finally beginning to weaken, though snow continued to fall in large, lazy flakes. "You said they caught you," Samuel prompted gently. "This morning, just after sunrise. 3 men on horseback cornered me near the agency buildings. They wanted to know what I had heard and who I might have told." Ayana's voice hardened. "When I refused to answer, they decided to eliminate the problem." "They tried to kill you?" "They tied me to a horse and dragged me into the hills, left me by those rocks to freeze or starve, whichever came first." Ayana's hand moved to the rope burns on her wrists. "They said the weather would make it look like an accident." Samuel felt anger building in his chest, the same cold fury that had sustained him through cavalry battles. Men who would torture and abandon a woman to die in a blizzard deserved no mercy and certainly no protection under any law he recognized. "Do you know who they were?" "Railroad men, I think, though they wore no uniforms. The leader had a scar across his nose and spoke like someone used to giving orders. He called the others Murphy and Cox. Samuel filed away the names, though they meant nothing to him. And you believe they'll come looking for you? If they think I'm still alive, yes. But perhaps the storm will convince them I died as they intended. Samuel stood and walked to the window, studying the snow-covered landscape. The storm was indeed weakening, and by tomorrow, travel would be possible again. If men were hunting Ayanna, they would resume their search as soon as the weather permitted. This railroad survey, Samuel said, turning back toward the bed. Do you know where they plan to run the tracks? Ayanna consulted the damaged paper again. The route follows the Yellowstone River Valley eastward, then turns north through the hills toward the Canadian border. It would pass directly through Apache winter grounds and several other tribal territories. A cold realization settled over Samuel. His ranch sat squarely in the path Ayanna had just described. If railroad surveyors were working in the area, his property would be among the first targets for acquisition, by purchase or by force. How much do you know about railroad development? Samuel asked. Enough to understand that money talks louder than treaties or moral obligations, Ayanna replied bitterly. My mother's people learned that lesson when gold was discovered in their sacred mountains. Samuel nodded grimly. He had seen enough of the frontier to know that economic interests usually trumped legal agreements when it came to dealing with native populations. The Transcontinental Railroad had already demonstrated that nothing would be allowed to stand in the way of progress and profit. A new sound cut through the diminishing wind outside the cabin. Samuel held up his hand for silence, listening carefully. It was the distant sound of horses, moving slowly through deep snow, but coming steadily closer. Ayanna's face went pale. They've come. Samuel moved quickly to the window and peered through the glass. 3 riders were approaching through the storm, their horses struggling through snow that reached nearly to their bellies. Even through the swirling flakes, Samuel could see they wore heavy coats and carried themselves with military bearing. Stay down and stay quiet, Samuel ordered, reaching for the rifle that hung above the fireplace. The weapon was well maintained and loaded, ready for wolves or other predators that might threaten his livestock. The riders drew closer, and Samuel could see more details. The lead rider was a large man with a distinctive scar across his nose, exactly as Ayanna had described. The other 2 flanked him, scanning the landscape with the systematic attention of professional hunters. Samuel moved away from the window and checked the rifle's action one more time. 7 years of peaceful ranch life had not dulled his soldiers' instincts, and those instincts were now screaming warnings about the approaching men. The riders stopped about 50 yards from the cabin, close enough for conversation but far enough to make accurate shooting difficult. The scarred leader cupped at his hands around his mouth and called out through the wind. Hello, the house. We're looking for a missing woman. Apache girl, small, probably hurt. Samuel waited a long moment before responding, using the time to assess the tactical situation. The men were well positioned and alert, suggesting military training. Their horses showed signs of hard riding despite the storm, indicating determination and resources. What's your interest in this woman? Samuel called back, stepping onto the porch but keeping the rifle ready. She stole something that doesn't belong to her, the leader replied. We're authorized to retrieve stolen property. What kind of property? Government documents. She's wanted for theft and assault. Samuel doubted that story, but he kept his skepticism out of his voice. Haven't seen anyone matching that description. You boys might want to find shelter before this weather gets worse. The leader conferred briefly with his companions, then urged his horse a few steps closer. Mind if we check your outbuildings? Won't take long. I do mind, Samuel replied firmly. This is private property, and you're not welcome without proper warrants. The tension in the air thickened. Samuel could see the men weighing their options, clearly frustrated by his resistance but uncertain how far they were willing to push matters. The storm provided some protection, making violence inadvisable for men who wanted to avoid complications. After another whispered conference, the scarred leader made his decision. We'll be back when the weather clears. If you're hiding that woman, you're making a big mistake. The 3 riders turned and rode back the way they had come, disappearing into the swirling snow. Samuel remained on the porch until he was certain they were gone, then hurried back inside. Ayanna was sitting up in bed, her face tense with fear and determination. You should have let them take me. Now you're in danger too. Let me worry about that, Samuel replied, setting the rifle aside. Right now, we need to figure out our next move. There is no our move, Ayana said firmly. This is my problem, and I won't drag an innocent man into it. Samuel pulled his chair closer to the bed and sat down. I stopped being innocent the day I put on a cavalry uniform. And those men just made this my problem when they threatened me on my own land. Ayana studied his face, seeing something there that made her reconsider. You were a soldier. For 6 years, learned a few things about fighting and a few more about right and wrong. And what does your conscience tell you about this situation? Samuel considered the question carefully. It tells me that men who would leave a woman to die in a blizzard probably aren't the kind of men I want to cooperate with. And it tells me that information important enough to kill for is information that needs to see daylight. Ayana was quiet for a long moment, weighing his words. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of something that might have been hope. There's more to this than just a railroad survey, she said finally. Much more. But if I tell you everything, there's no going back. You'll be committed to seeing this through, whatever the cost. I'm already committed, Samuel replied, the moment I pulled you out of that storm. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside the cabin, two people who had been strangers 12 hours ago began to plan a fight against forces larger and more dangerous than either had imagined. The winter storm had brought them together by chance, but what would hold them together was a shared understanding that some things were worth risking everything to protect. As evening approached and the storm finally began to exhaust itself, Samuel built up the fire one more time. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult decisions, but tonight, warmth and safety were enough. He had found purpose again in protecting someone who needed protection. And for the first time in 7 years, the empty cabin felt less like a tomb and more like a home. The storm broke during the night, leaving behind a world transformed by 2 feet of pristine snow that sparkled like crushed diamonds under the morning sun. Samuel woke before dawn, as was his habit, but found himself listening for sounds from the small room where Ayana slept. Her breathing remained steady and deep, the sleep of someone whose body was still recovering from its ordeal. Samuel dressed quietly and stepped outside to assess the damage. The cold hit him like a physical blow, sharp and clean in the still air. His breath formed white clouds that hung motionless in the windless morning. The snow had drifted against the cabin walls and covered the corral fence, but the basic structures had weathered the storm well. In the distance, he could see dark shapes moving slowly across the white expanse where his cattle had gathered near the windbreak he had built along the northern boundary. More importantly, he could see no sign of the 3 riders who had visited yesterday. Their tracks were buried under fresh snow, and the landscape showed no evidence of human presence except for the thin column of smoke rising from his own chimney. Samuel fed and watered his horse, then began the laborious process of digging paths through the snow to the essential buildings. The work was hard but familiar, the kind of physical labor that cleared his mind and helped him think through complicated problems. And the problem of Ayana was certainly complicated. By the time he finished the morning chores, the sun had climbed high enough to begin melting the snow on south-facing surfaces. Water dripped from the cabin eaves in a steady rhythm, and patches of dark earth began to show through the white blanket. Within a few days, travel would be possible again, which meant decisions could not be postponed much longer. Samuel found Ayana awake when he returned to the cabin, sitting up in bed and examining the damaged document in the morning light. She looked much better than she had the previous day, with color in her cheeks and alertness in her eyes. The cuts on her face were healing cleanly, and the rope burns on her wrists had stopped bleeding. "How are you feeling?" Samuel asked, hanging his coat near the door. "Stronger," Ayana replied. "Strong enough to think clearly about what comes next." Samuel poured coffee into 2 tin cups and handed one to her. "And what do you think comes next?" Ayana sipped the coffee gratefully before answering. "I need to tell you the whole truth about what I know and why those men want me dead. But once I do, you'll understand why staying here puts you in terrible danger." "I'm listening." Ayana set down her cup and smoothed the wrinkled document on her lap. "My story begins with my mother, Elena Vasquez. She was the daughter of a Mexican rancher whose family had lived in what is now New Mexico for generations. When she was 16, Comancheros raided her father's ranch and took her to sell as a slave. Samuel had heard of the Comancheros, the mixed blood traders who dealt in horses, weapons, and human captives throughout the Southwest. They were among the most feared criminals on the frontier, answering to no law except profit. The Comancheros sold her to a Mescalero Apache band, Ayana continued, but instead of making her a slave, the war chief took her as his wife. My mother learned Apache ways and bore 3 children. I was the youngest. What happened to your family? The usual story. Gold was discovered in our mountain homeland, and white miners demanded military protection. The Army decided the easiest solution was to move all Apache bands to a reservation far from the goldfields. Ayana's voice hardened. My father refused to leave the sacred places of his ancestors. He died fighting cavalry troops in 1874. Samuel knew the history she was describing. The Apache Wars had raged throughout the 1870s, with atrocities committed by both sides and suffering endured by anyone caught between the opposing forces. He had been fortunate to serve in Montana rather than Arizona Territory, where the fighting had been particularly brutal. After my father's death, my mother took my brothers and me to the reservation at San Carlos, Ayana continued. But reservation life was hard, and many people died from disease and hunger. When I was 18, Indian agents offered me work as a translator because I spoke Spanish, Apache, and English. Is that how you learned about the railroad survey? Partly, but there's more to it than that. Ayana folded the document carefully. 6 weeks ago, I was translating for a meeting between Indian agency officials and men who claimed to represent the territorial government. They spoke freely in front of me because they assumed I was just another ignorant reservation Indian who couldn't understand their plans. Samuel waited for her to continue, sensing that the most important revelations were yet to come. The men weren't really government officials, Ayana said. They represented a private company that had discovered something valuable in the Apache winter grounds. Not gold this time, but something potentially much more precious. What did they find? Ayana lowered her voice, though they were alone in the cabin. Silver, a vein so rich it could produce more wealth than all the California goldfields combined. But the deposit lies directly beneath the sacred valley where my mother's people hold their winter ceremonies. The implications hit Samuel like a punch to the stomach. A silver discovery of that magnitude would bring thousands of miners, merchants, and speculators into the territory. It would also provide more than enough motivation for men to commit murder to protect their secret. The railroad survey is just the first step, Ayana continued. They plan to use the railway as justification for removing the Apache from their winter grounds. Once the land is cleared, they can begin mining operations without interference from treaty obligations or moral considerations. How many people know about this? Very few, I think. The survey team, some railroad executives, and whoever is financing the operation. They've been very careful to keep the information secret until they can secure legal control of the land. Samuel stood and walked to the window, processing what he had learned. Outside, the snow continued its steady melt under the strengthening sun. By tomorrow, the roads would be passable, and normal life would resume throughout the territory. But for Ayana, there might be no return to normal life if the men hunting her had their way. There's something else, Ayana said quietly, something that makes my situation even more dangerous. Samuel turned back toward her, noting the tension that had crept into her voice. The man with the scar, the one who led the group yesterday, his name is Marcus Webb, and he used to work for the Army as a civilian scout. I recognized him from San Carlos, though he didn't remember me. Ayana paused, gathering courage for what came next. Webb was involved in the massacre at Skeleton Canyon last year. Samuel felt cold fingers of dread crawl up his spine. The massacre at Skeleton Canyon had been one of the worst atrocities of the Apache Wars, where a group of civilian contractors had murdered more than 40 Apache women and children under the pretext of searching for raiders. The incident had been officially covered up, but rumors of what really happened had spread throughout military circles. Webb was one of the men who organized that attack, Ayana continued. He won't hesitate to kill anyone who threatens his current operation, especially an Apache woman who knows too much about his business. Why haven't you reported what you know to the proper authorities? Which authorities? Ayana asked bitterly. The Indian agency officials who were present at the meeting? The territorial government that profits from land sales? The army that covers up massacres when convenient? Samuel had no answer for that. His own experience with military justice had left him skeptical of official channels when serious money and political influence were involved. So what do you plan to do? I've been thinking about that all morning, Ayanna replied. Webb and his men believe I'm dead, frozen in yesterday's storm. If I can stay hidden until they leave the territory, I might be able to reach someone who can expose their plans. Who did you have in mind? There's a newspaper editor in Helena, a man named Charles Morrison, who has written about government corruption before. If I could get the survey documents to him, along with testimony about what I overheard, he might be willing to publish the story. Samuel considered the plan, looking for weaknesses. Helena is more than 100 miles from here, through country that's probably crawling with Webb's people. And even if you reach this Morrison fellow, what makes you think he'd take the word of an Apache woman over railroad money? Because Morrison's wife is Apache, Ayanna said simply. He married a woman from the Fort Apache Reservation 5 years ago. The story appeared in newspapers throughout the territory because it was so unusual. That did change the calculation significantly. A newspaper editor with personal connections to the Apache community would be more likely to take Ayanna's accusations seriously, especially if she could provide documented evidence. The problem is still getting you to Helena alive, Samuel pointed out. Webb's men know this territory, and they'll be watching the obvious routes. I know, Ayanna admitted. That's why I think my only chance is to wait until spring, when travel is easier and there are more people on the roads to provide cover. That's 3 months from now. Do you think you can stay hidden that long? Before Ayanna could answer, Samuel heard a sound that made his blood freeze. Horses were approaching the cabin, moving at a steady walk through the snow. He grabbed his rifle and moved to the window, staying low and peering carefully around the edge of the frame. 4 riders this time, not 3. Webb and his original companions, plus a 4th man Samuel didn't recognize. They had approached from the south using the tree line for concealment until they were within 100 yards of the cabin. They're back, Samuel whispered to Ayanna. 4 of them now. Ayanna's face went pale, but her voice remained steady. You have to let them search. If they think you're hiding something, they'll kill you too. I'm not handing you over to be murdered. Then we're both dead, Ayanna replied grimly. Samuel watched the riders through the window, noting their positions and equipment. All 4 men carried rifles in addition to sidearms, and they moved with the coordination of a well-trained unit. Webb was clearly the leader, directing the others with hand signals that indicated military experience. The riders stopped near the same position Webb had chosen the day before, far enough away to make rushing them impossible, but close enough for conversation. Webb dismounted and walked several steps closer to the cabin before cupping his hands around his mouth. Morning, neighbor. Name's Webb, Territorial Land Commissioner. Need to ask you a few questions. Samuel grimaced at the lie. Webb was no more a land commissioner than Samuel was the governor of Montana Territory, but the claim provided official soundings justification for whatever the man planned to do next. What kind of questions? Samuel called back, stepping onto the porch with his rifle visible but not directly threatening. Questions about trespassers and stolen property. We're investigating reports of criminal activity in this area. Already told you yesterday I haven't seen anyone matching your description. Webb's voice hardened slightly. Yesterday I was asking politely. Today I'm conducting an official investigation. I'll need to search your property. Samuel felt sweat forming despite the cold air. He was outnumbered and outgunned, with no cover between the cabin and the nearest tree line. If shooting started, he and Ayanna would have little chance of survival. You got papers for that search? Samuel demanded, buying time to think. Webb reached into his coat and pulled out a folded document, holding it up so Samuel could see the official-looking seals and signatures. Right here, signed by Judge Harrison and Helena. You can read it after we're done. The document was almost certainly forged, but from a distance, Samuel couldn't prove that. More importantly, Webb's willingness to produce papers suggested he was confident enough to risk scrutiny, which meant he had backing from people with real authority. Samuel made his decision. All right, but I'm coming with you. This is my property, and I want to know what you're looking for. Fair enough, Webb replied. Just keep that rifle pointed down in your hands where we can see them. Samuel stepped down from the barge and walked toward the mounted men, trying to project calm confidence while his mind raced through possibilities. Behind him, he could only hope that Ayanna would find a way to hide herself effectively. Webb was even larger up close, with the weathered features and permanent squint of someone who had spent years on the frontier. The scar across his nose was old but distinctive, a white line that pulled one corner of his mouth into a perpetual sneer. His eyes were pale blue and completely without warmth. "Appreciate your cooperation," Webb said, though his tone suggested anything but appreciation. "My men are going to take a look around your buildings. Won't take long." "What exactly are you looking for?" "Missing Apache girl, like we told you yesterday. Small, dark-skinned, probably injured. She stole important documents from the Indian agency and assaulted a federal officer." Samuel knew the story was fabricated, but he nodded as if accepting it. "Haven't seen anyone like that. Of course, I was inside most of yesterday because of the storm." "That's why we need to check your buildings," Webb replied. "She might have found shelter without you knowing about it." The other three men had dismounted and were moving toward the cabin with the systematic thoroughness of professional searchers. Samuel watched them work, noting how they checked not just the obvious hiding places, but also areas where someone might try to conceal evidence. One of the searchers emerged from the cabin and shook his head at Webb. They moved on to the barn, the storage shed, and the small bunkhouse Samuel had built for seasonal help. Each search was quick but thorough, and Samuel began to hope that Ayanna had found an adequate hiding place. Then the fourth man, the new addition to Webb's team, called out from behind the cabin. "Got tracks back here. Fresh ones leading toward the creek." Samuel's heart sank. The tracks were probably his own, made during morning chores, but Webb wouldn't know that. The searcher's discovery gave Webb justification for expanding his investigation. "Let's take a look," Webb said, gesturing for Samuel to accompany them. They walked around the cabin to where the fourth man stood pointing at footprints in the snow. The prints were indeed fresh, made after the storm had ended, and they led from the cabin toward the creek that bordered Samuel's property. "These yours?" Webb asked Samuel. "Could be. I was out checking on my cattle this morning." Webb knelt and examined the tracks more closely. "Small feet. Could be a woman's." "Could be mine," Samuel replied evenly. "I don't wear particularly large boots." Webb stood and brushed snow from his knees. "We'll follow them and see where they lead." The tracks meandered through the snow toward the creek, which ran about 200 yards behind the cabin. Samuel's anxiety grew with each step, knowing that if Ayanna had tried to hide near the water, the searchers would find her easily. But when they reached the creek, the tracks simply ended at the water's edge. The stream was running fast enough to prevent ice formation, and anyone wading into the current would leave no trail to follow. "Cross the creek," Webb muttered, scanning the far bank for continuation of the trail. "Or just came down for water," Samuel suggested. "I do that sometimes when I'm checking the fence line." Webb studied the scene for several minutes, clearly frustrated by the inconclusive evidence. His men spread out along the creek bank, looking for any sign that someone had emerged from the water downstream. "Boss," one of the searchers called from 50 yards away, "found something over here." The group hurried toward the man, who stood near a fallen log that had created a small eddy in the stream. Caught on a branch just above the waterline was a small piece of fabric, torn and wet but clearly from a dress or shirt. Webb examined the cloth carefully. "Deerskin, decorated with beads. That's Apache work." Samuel felt his stomach clench. The fabric was obviously from Ayanna's dress, probably torn loose during her ordeal yesterday. But how it had ended up here was a mystery. "Looks like she tried to cross here and got swept downstream," Webb concluded. "Creek's running fast. She could have been carried a long way before she managed to get out." One of Webb's men spoke up. "If she was already hurt from yesterday, cold water like that would finish her quick." Webb nodded thoughtfully. "Spread out along the creek. Look for a body or signs where she might have crawled out. If she's dead, I want to find the corpse." The searchers began working their way downstream, examining every eddy and fallen tree that might have caught a body. Samuel followed, trying to appear helpful while inwardly praying that they would find nothing. After an hour of searching, Webb called his men back. They had found no further evidence of Ayanna's presence, dead or alive. The creek showed no obvious exit points, and the water was too deep and fast to examine thoroughly. "She's probably wedged under a log somewhere downstream," Webb told Samuel. "We'll check the backwater areas when the snow melts more." Lot of work for one missing Indian girl, Samuel observed carefully. Webb's eyes hardened. She had information that could cause problems for a lot of important people. Dead, she's just another casualty of frontier life. Alive, she's a threat to economic development throughout the territory. The casual admission of murderous intent sent chills down Samuel's spine, but he kept his expression neutral. Well, if she went into that creek yesterday, she's not a threat to anyone anymore. Probably not, Webb agreed, but I'll be keeping an eye on this area just in case. You see anything suspicious, anything at all, you send word to me in Red Lodge. Will do, Samuel lied. Webb and his men mounted their horses and rode away, disappearing into the forest that bordered the creek. Samuel waited until he was certain they were gone before hurrying back to the cabin. He found Ayanna emerging from a hiding place he would never have suspected. She had somehow concealed herself in the root cellar beneath the cabin floor, accessible through a trap door hidden under Samuel's bed. The space was cramped and cold, but it had kept her safe during the search. How did you know about that? Samuel asked. I heard you walking around above me and figured out the layout, Ayanna explained. The floor sounded hollow in one spot, so I looked until I found the entrance. And the fabric by the creek? I tore it from my dress and threw it in the water from the cabin window while they were searching the barn. I hoped it would make them think I had drowned. Samuel shook his head in admiration. Quick thinking. It worked too. Webb thinks you're dead. For now, Ayanna replied grimly, but he'll keep watching this area, and if I show myself anywhere in the territory, word will get back to him eventually. Samuel helped Ayanna back to bed, noting that the effort of hiding had exhausted her limited strength. She was healing but slowly, and she would need weeks of rest and good food before she could attempt any kind of journey. We need to make plans, Samuel said, settling into his chair. Webb isn't going to give up easily, and spring will bring more people into the territory. Sooner or later, someone will see you and word will spread. I've been thinking about that, Ayanna replied. There might be another way to get the information to someone who can use it. What do you mean? You could go to Helena yourself, take the documents and my testimony to the newspaper editor. Tell him what you've witnessed here. Samuel considered the idea. Morrison doesn't know me. Why would he believe a stranger's story? Because you're a white man with military service and property ownership. Your word carries weight that mine never could. The bitter truth of that statement hung in the air between them. Samuel knew that Ayanna was right about the prejudices they would face. A white rancher's testimony would be taken seriously in ways that an Apache woman's never would be. It would mean leaving you here alone for at least a week, Samuel pointed out. Maybe longer if the weather turns bad. I'll manage. I'm stronger now, and I know how to stay hidden. Samuel wasn't convinced. Ayanna was healing, but she was still vulnerable, and Webb's men might return at any time. Leaving her alone felt like abandonment, regardless of the practical advantages. There's another problem, Samuel said. If I go to Helena with this story, and if Morrison publishes it, everyone will know the information came from this ranch. Webb will figure out that you're alive, and he'll come back with more men. Ayanna was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When she spoke again, her voice carried a note of resignation. Then we need to be prepared for that possibility. What do you mean? I mean, we need to decide whether preserving my life is worth allowing Webb and his partners to steal Apache land and profit from genocide. The stark choice she presented hit Samuel like a physical blow. He had served in the cavalry, had participated in actions against hostile tribes, but he had never been forced to confront the moral complexities, the larger conflict between white expansion and native survival. There has to be another way, Samuel said finally. Maybe, but if there is, I can't see it. Samuel stood and walked to the window, studying the snow-covered landscape that stretched toward the mountains. Somewhere out there, men were planning to steal land and destroy lives for the sake of silver and profit. And here in his cabin sat a young woman whose only crime had been overhearing their conspiracy. Tell me about your mother, Samuel said suddenly. What was she like? Ayanna seemed surprised by the change of subject, but she answered readily. Strong, stronger than anyone I've ever known. She survived being taken from her family, learned a new language and new customs, bore children in a world that saw her as property, and she never stopped believing that things could be better. What would she tell you to do now? She would tell me to fight. Not with weapons, though she could use those too when necessary. She would tell me to fight with truth and courage and the knowledge that some things are worth any sacrifice. Samuel nodded slowly. Then that's what we'll do. We'll fight. We? You said it yourself. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about justice and doing what's right. I may not be able to undo the things I did during the war, but I can try to prevent new atrocities from being committed. Ayanna studied his face carefully. You understand what you are committing to? If we expose Webb's conspiracy, there's no going back to your quiet life here. My quiet life ended the moment I found you in that storm, Samuel replied. Everything that happens from now on is just consequences. Outside, the sun had climbed high enough to begin melting snow from the cabin roof. Water dripped steadily from the eaves, marking time like a slow clock. Inside, two people from different worlds began to plan a campaign that would either bring justice to the Montana Territory or get them both killed in the attempt. As evening approached, Samuel built up the fire and began preparing a more substantial meal than the simple broth and bread they had been sharing. If they were going to fight Webb and his allies, they would need their strength. There's something else I need to tell you, Ayanna said as they ate. Something about the silver deposit that makes this situation even more complicated. Samuel waited for her to continue, though he couldn't imagine how the situation could become more complex than it already was. The silver isn't in the Apache winter grounds by accident, Ayanna explained. According to Apache oral tradition, the deposit was known to my mother's people for generations. They considered it sacred, part of the spiritual foundation that made the Winter Valley so important to our ceremonies. They never minded? Never. Taking silver from the sacred mountain would be like stealing stones from a church altar. The metal was meant to stay in the earth, protecting the spiritual power of the place. Samuel felt a new dimension of the crime being planned against the Apache. It wasn't just theft of land or resources, but desecration of something holy, destruction of beliefs and traditions that had sustained a people for centuries. How many people know about the Apache connection to the silver? Samuel asked. I don't know. The oral traditions aren't shared with outsiders, but there might be written records from old Spanish expeditions or missionary reports. That raised another troubling possibility. If Spanish colonial records contained information about Apache silver deposits, then researchers working for the railroad company might have discovered those references. The conspiracy could be much older and more carefully planned than either Samuel or Ayanna had realized. We're going to need help, Samuel concluded. More help than one newspaper editor, no matter how sympathetic he might be. What kind of help? Legal help, political help, military help if necessary. This conspiracy involves federal land policy and treaty violations. There have to be people in Washington who would be interested in exposing it. You sound like a man who still believes the system can work. Samuel smiled grimly. I sound like a man who's run out of other options. Sometimes the system works if you push it hard enough and in the right places. They talked late into the night, developing plans and considering possibilities. Neither had illusions about the dangers they faced, but both understood that some fights were worth fighting regardless of the odds. When they finally settled down to sleep, Samuel in his chair and Ayanna on the bed in Thomas's old room, the cabin felt different than it had in years. Not empty anymore, but full of purpose and determination. Outside, the Montana winter continued its slow retreat, each day bringing more warmth and the promise of spring. But inside the cabin, two people who had found each other in a storm were preparing for a different kind of weather, the kind that would test everything they believed about courage, justice, and the price of doing what was right. Spring arrived in Montana Territory like a promise kept, slowly at first with cautious warmth that melted snow from south-facing slopes, then with increasing confidence as longer days began to transform the frozen landscape. Samuel watched the season change from his cabin window, noting how each passing day brought new possibilities for travel and new dangers for the woman who had shared his home for 3 months. Ayanna had grown stronger during the winter weeks, her injuries healing completely, and her body regaining the vitality that cold and violence had nearly stolen. She moved through the cabin with quiet grace, helping with cooking and mending, sharing stories of her childhood that painted pictures of a world Samuel was only beginning to understand. But beneath her growing health lay a tension that increased with each warm day, the knowledge that spring would force decisions that could no longer be delayed. They had developed routines during the long winter months, patterns of daily life that felt natural despite the extraordinary circumstances that had brought them together. Samuel still slept in his chair by the fire, though Ayanna had offered many times to take that uncomfortable position herself. She had moved from Thomas's small room to the main area of the cabin, sleeping on a bed they had fashioned from blankets and buffalo robes near the hearth. The arrangement might have seemed improper to outside observers, but it felt right to both of them. They were two people who had found safety in each other's presence, protection from loneliness that went deeper than physical shelter. Samuel had not felt such peace in his own home since Mary and Thomas died, and Ayanna had never known the security of a place where her presence was welcomed rather than merely tolerated. But peace was a luxury they could not afford indefinitely. Webb's men had returned twice during the winter, ostensibly checking for signs that Ayanna might have survived her presumed drowning in the creek. Both times, Samuel had met them with calm cooperation, allowing searches of his buildings while Ayanna remained hidden in the root cellar. Each visit confirmed that Webb remained suspicious, but not certain, dangerous but not yet desperate. The real crisis began on a warm March morning when Samuel discovered something that changed everything they thought they knew about their situation. He had been checking the fence line along his eastern boundary when he noticed survey stakes driven into the ground at regular intervals. Fresh stakes placed within the past few days, marked with numbers and symbols that indicated professional surveying work. Samuel followed the line of stakes with growing alarm. They ran directly through his property, marking a route that would bisect his best grazing land and pass within 100 yards of his cabin. At the southern end of the surveyed line, he found a more substantial marker, a wooden post with a brass plate that read, Montana Territory Railroad Survey, Section 12, mile marker 47. The implications hit him like a physical blow. The railroad wasn't just planning to cross Apache land, it was planning to cross his land, probably through eminent domain proceedings that would give him no choice in the matter. Everything he had built, everything he owned, lay directly in the path of progress and profit. Samuel hurried back to the cabin to share the discovery with Ayanna. He found her in the kitchen, grinding cornmeal for bread, humming softly to herself in a way that had become familiar during their months together. The domestic scene struck him with unexpected poignancy, a glimpse of the life they might have built together under different circumstances. "They've been here," Samuel said without preamble. "Survey stakes all along the eastern boundary. The railroad is coming through my property." Ayanna stopped grinding and looked up, her expression immediately serious. "When?" "Recently. The stakes are fresh, probably placed within the last week." "Then they were moving faster than we expected. The snow must have delayed their work, but now they're making up for lost time." Samuel sat down at the kitchen table, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "I should have seen this coming. Of course they'd want to cross here. It's the most direct route from the Yellowstone Valley to the Northern Territories." "It also means Webb knows you lied to him," Ayanna pointed out. "If they're surveying your property, they've probably been watching it for weeks. They may already suspect I'm alive and hiding here." The possibility sent cold dread through Samuel's chest. If Webb suspected Ayanna was alive, their winter of careful concealment skulls had been nothing more than an illusion of safety. "We need to accelerate our plans," Samuel said. "I should leave for Helena immediately before Webb realizes what we're doing." "It's too late for that," Ayanna replied quietly. "Look." Samuel turned toward the window and felt his heart sink. 3 riders were approaching from the south, moving at an unhurried pace that suggested confidence rather than urgency. Even at a distance, Samuel could recognize Webb's distinctive silhouette. "How long do we have?" Ayanna asked, already moving toward the hidden entrance to the root cellar. "Maybe 5 minutes." "But Ayanna," Samuel paused, struck by a sudden realization. "If they're surveying the property, they might have instruments that could detect the cellar. Surveying equipment can sometimes identify underground spaces." Ayanna stopped in her tracks, understanding the implication immediately. Her best hiding place might no longer be safe, and there was nowhere else in the cabin that could conceal her from a thorough search. "The barn," Samuel said quickly. "The hayloft has loose boards in the back wall. You might be able to slip through and hide in the forest." And if they see me running, then we fight. Ayanna nodded grimly and gathered the few possessions she had acquired during her stay. The damaged railroad survey document went into a leather pouch she wore beneath her dress, along with a letter she had written detailing everything she had overheard at the Indian agency. Samuel had helped her compose the letter during the long winter evenings, crafting it to be as credible and detailed as possible. They moved quickly toward the barn, but before they reached it, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made it clear they were too late. Webb and his men had covered the final distance faster than expected, and they were now close enough to see anyone who tried to cross the open ground between buildings. "Back to the cabin," Samuel ordered. "We'll have to try the cellar and hope for the best." They reversed direction, but again they were too late. Webb's voice rang out across the clearing, closer than Samuel had expected. "Morning, Garrett. Beautiful day, isn't it?" Samuel stepped onto the cabin porch, leaving the door slightly ajar behind him. "Morning, Webb. What brings you out this way?" Webb had dismounted and was walking toward the cabin with two companions Samuel didn't recognize. Both men carried themselves like professional gunfighters, and both wore their weapons with the easy familiarity of frequent use. "Just checking on our survey work," Webb replied conversationally, "making sure we haven't missed anything important." "Your survey work? Didn't I mention? My company has the contract for surveying the new railroad route through this section. Imagine my surprise when I realized the line runs right through your property." Samuel forced his expression to remain neutral. "First I've heard of it. Well, these things move fast once they get started. Railroad development waits for no man." Webb's tone remained friendly, but his eyes held the cold alertness of a predator. "Mind if we come in for a moment? I'd like to discuss compensation for the right-of-way. I'm not interested in selling." "Oh, you might not have a choice in that matter. Eminent domain is a powerful tool when public necessity is involved." Webb stepped closer to the porch. "But let's discuss this in Mon, Shimei. No point in conducting business outdoors." Samuel knew he was trapped. Refusing entry would confirm Webb's suspicions, but allowing the men inside would almost certainly lead to Ayanna's discovery. He made the only choice available. "All right, but my hospitality doesn't extend to armed men in my home. You can leave your weapons on the porch." Webb smiled without warmth. "I'm afraid that's not acceptable. These are dangerous times, and my men don't go anywhere unarmed." "Then we can conduct our business right here in the open." The standoff stretched for a long moment, neither man willing to concede the advantage. Samuel was acutely aware that Ayanna was trapped inside the cabin with no means of escape, while Webb seemed to be enjoying the tactical situation. "Tell you what," Webb said finally, "why don't we compromise? You invite us in for coffee, and we'll keep this friendly and civilized. Refuse, and I'll be forced to exercise my authority as a federal marshal to search these premises for stolen government property." Samuel felt his blood freeze. Federal marshal? Webb reached into his coat and produced a badge and identification papers. The documents appeared authentic, complete with official seals and signatures. If Webb truly held federal authority, resistance would be not just futile but illegal. "Appointed 3 weeks ago to investigate thefts from the Indian agency," Webb explained. "Amazing how a federal badge can cut through red tape in local jurisdictions." Samuels, who knew the appointment was probably legitimate, purchased with railroad money and political influence, but legally valid nonetheless. Webb had maneuvered himself into a position where he could operate with government authority while pursuing his private agenda. "What exactly are you investigating?" Samuel asked, though he already knew the answer. "Theft of confidential government documents by a female Apache interpreter named Ayanna Vasquez, last seen in this area during a winter storm 3 months ago." The use of Ayanna's full name confirmed Samuel's worst fears. Webb knew exactly who he was hunting, and he had enough information to suggest official cooperation from someone at the Indian agency. "I already told you I haven't seen anyone matching that description." "Yes, you did tell me that, several times in fact." Webb's smile became predatory. "But circumstances have changed since our last conversation. We now have evidence that suggests the subject may have survived her encounter with the creek." "What evidence?" Instead of answering directly, Webb gestured to one of his companions. The man stepped forward and opened a leather satchel, removing several items that he laid out on a wooden crate like pieces of evidence in a courtroom. Boot prints found along the creek bank 2 weeks ago, Webb said, pointing to detailed sketches. Prints that match moccasins rather than standard boots. Someone has been visiting that area regularly, someone with small feet and knowledge of Apache tracking methods. Samuel's heart sank as he realized his mistake. He had been checking the creek periodically during the winter, looking for any sign that Webb's men had discovered Ayanna's true fate, but his visits had left traces that skilled trackers could read like a story. Could be anyone, Samuel said weakly. Lots of people wear moccasins in this territory. Perhaps. But combined with other evidence, a pattern emerges. Webb pointed to the second item, a small piece of charred wood. This came from your fire pit. Analysis shows it was burned recently, and embedded in the charcoal are fibers from Apache clothing. Samuel realized with growing horror that Ayanna must have burned pieces of her damaged dress to eliminate evidence. But the precaution that seemed so smart at the time had left traces that expert investigation could detect. And finally, Webb continued, indicating the third item, we have testimony from a reliable source. The final piece of evidence was a written statement, signed and notarized. Samuel couldn't read the details from where he stood, but Webb's confident presentation suggested it contained damaging information. Testimony from whom? A local rancher who observed unusual activity around your property during the winter months. Smoke from your chimney at unusual hours, larger food purchases than normal for a single man, lights in windows that should have been empty. Samuel felt the web closing around him. Webb had been building a case for months, gathering evidence with the patience and thoroughness of someone who knew he would eventually get his chance to act. All very interesting, Samuel said, fighting to keep his voice steady. But it doesn't prove anything illegal happened here. No, it doesn't, but it does provide sufficient justification for a thorough search under federal authority. Webb replaced his identification in his coat. Now, shall we conduct this search with your cooperation, or do I need to place you under arrest for obstruction of a federal investigation? Samuel knew he had run out of options. Resistance would only confirm Webb's suspicions and probably result in violence that Ayanna couldn't survive. His only hope was that she had found a hiding place that even a thorough search might miss. All right, Samuel said reluctantly, but I want to see those credentials again, and I want to understand exactly what authority you're claiming. Webb obliged, producing his papers with evident satisfaction. Samuel examined them carefully, noting the authentic appearance of the seals and signatures. If the documents were forged, they were expertly done by him. Federal Marshal Webb, appointed by the Department of Interior to investigate thefts of classified materials from Indian agency facilities, Samuel read aloud, authorized to pursue suspects and recover stolen property by any means necessary. That's correct. And the stolen property in question includes survey documents that are vital to national railroad development. Very serious business. Samuel handed back the papers and stepped aside. Then I suppose you'd better conduct your search. Webb and his men entered the cabin with the systematic efficiency of professional investigators. They began with the main room, examining every corner, every piece of furniture, every potential hiding place. Samuel watched with growing anxiety as they worked their way through the space, knowing that each minute brought them closer to discovering Ayanna. One of Webb's men had particular expertise in detecting concealed spaces. He moved through the room, tapping walls and floors, listening for the hollow sounds that might indicate hidden compartments. When he reached the area near Samuel's bed, he paused and tapped again. Got something here, boss. Floor sounds different in this section. Samuel's heart hammered as the man knelt and began examining the floorboards more carefully. Within minutes, he had located the edges of the concealed trapdoor that led to the root cellar. Well, Webb said with satisfaction. What have we here? The man pried up the trapdoor, revealing the small underground space that had been Ayanna's refuge during previous searches. Samuel held his breath, praying that she had found somewhere else to hide. The cellar was empty. Webb's expression darkened as he examined the space. Clearly, he had expected to find Ayanna cowering in the underground chamber. Instead, he found only evidence that someone had been using it regularly: a folded blanket, a tin cup, and crumbs from bread and dried meat. Someone's been living down here, Webb observed. Someone small enough to fit comfortably in this space. I use it for storage, Samuel lied. Food supplies, winter gear, things like that. Do you sleep down there too? Webb asked sarcastically, holding up the blanket. This shows clear signs of regular use as bedding. Samuel had no good answer for that observation. The evidence of human habitation was too clear to deny, and Webb was too experienced to be fooled by weak explanations. Webb climbed out of the cellar and dusted off his hands. She was here, recently. The question now is where she's gone. I don't know what you're talking about. Of course you don't. Webb turned to his men. Tear this place apart. Check every inch, every board, every stone. If there's another hiding place, find it. The search that followed was thorough and destructive. Webb's men pulled apart furniture, emptied drawers and cabinets, and examined every potential hiding spot in the cabin. They found nothing because Ayanna was no longer inside. But they did find something else that made Samuel's blood run cold. Boss, you need to see this. One of the searchers had discovered Samuel's collection of military documents and personal papers, including his service records from the cavalry. Among them was a letter Samuel had written but never sent, a draft of correspondence to the newspaper editor in Helena, detailing everything he and Ayanna had discovered about the railroad conspiracy. Webb read the letter with growing anger, his face darkening with each paragraph. When he finished, he looked at Samuel with undisguised hatred. So you were planning to betray your own country for the sake of a murdering Apache squaw? I was planning to expose a criminal conspiracy, Samuel replied firmly. There's a difference. The only conspiracy here is your treasonous cooperation with enemies of lawful development. Webb folded the letter and placed it in his coat. This document provides all the evidence I need to place you under federal arrest. On what charges? Harboring a fugitive, obstruction of federal investigation, and conspiracy to interfere with lawful railroad development. Webb's smile returned, cold and triumphant. You'll find that federal judges take a dim view of people who put personal sympathies ahead of national progress. Samuel realized that Webb had maneuvered him into an impossible position. The letter provided legal justification for arrest and prosecution, while Ayanna's absence meant that Samuel had gained nothing from his months of protection and concealment. Where is she, Garrett? Webb demanded. You can make this easier on yourself by cooperating fully. I told you, I don't know. Then you'll have plenty of time to think about it in federal custody. Webb gestured to his men. Shackle him. As the men moved towards Samuel with iron restraints, a new voice cut through the tension from outside the cabin. I wouldn't do that if I were you. Everyone turned toward the door, where a figure stood silhouetted against the afternoon sun. As the person stepped into the cabin, Samuel felt his heart leap with recognition and dread. Ayanna had returned, but she was not alone. Behind her stood 3 Apache warriors in traditional dress, their faces painted for war and their weapons ready for use. Behind them, Samuel could see additional figures moving through the trees around the cabin. Ayanna, no, Samuel whispered, understanding immediately that she was sacrificing her safety to protect him. It's all right, Samuel, Ayanna replied calmly. The time for hiding is over. Webb's men had instinctively reached for their weapons, but they hesitated as they realized they were badly outnumbered. Through the cabin windows, more Apache warriors became visible, surrounding the building with disciplined precision. Who are these people? Webb demanded, though his voice had lost much of its confidence. My family, Ayanna replied simply. My uncle, White Hawk, and warriors from the winter camp you plan to destroy. The largest of the Apache men stepped forward, his bearing and decorations marking him as a chief of considerable importance. When he spoke, his English was precise and formal. I am White Hawk, war chief of the Mescalero Apache. This woman is my sister's daughter, and she is under my protection. Webb's face went pale as he realized the implications. A confrontation with armed Apache warriors could escalate into exactly the kind of incident that would draw unwanted attention to his activities. This woman is a federal fugitive, Webb said, trying to reassert his authority. I have warrants for her arrest. Your warrants have no meaning on Apache land, White Hawk replied calmly, and this cabin sits on land that belongs to my people by treaty right. Samuel stared at White Hawk in confusion. His ranch was clearly outside any established reservation boundaries, purchased legally through the Territorial Land Office. That's impossible, Webb protested. This land was surveyed and sold through proper legal channels. White Hawk smiled grimly. Legal according to whose law? The Treaty of 1868 established Apache hunting rights throughout this region. Those rights were never formally surrendered, despite what your government papers might claim. Ayanna stepped closer to Samuel, her eyes bright with something that might have been hope. I found them yesterday when I went to gather herbs by the creek. Uncle Whitehawk has been searching for me since word reached the winter camp about the railroad plans. How did they know to look for you here? Because I told them about the kind white man who saved my life and shared his home with me through the winter. Whitehawk's voice carried unmistakable respect. My niece spoke of your honor and courage. Such qualities are rare among your people. Samuel felt overwhelmed by the rapid changes in his situation. Minutes ago, he had been facing arrest and imprisonment. Now he found himself under the protection of Apache warriors and claimed as an ally by their chief. Webb was clearly struggling to reassess the tactical situation. His federal authority meant nothing if it triggered an armed confrontation with Apache forces, especially on land where treaty rights were unclear. This doesn't change anything, Webb said finally. The woman is still wanted for theft of federal property. What property? Whitehawk demanded. Speak plainly of these accusations. Ayanna reached into her dress and removed the leather pouch containing the railroad survey document. He means this: information about plans to steal Apache land and desecrate sacred places for the sake of silver mining. She handed the document to Whitehawk, who examined it carefully before passing it to one of his warriors. Samuel watched the Apache men's faces darken as they absorbed the implications of what they were reading. This document describes the rape of our most sacred valley, Whitehawk said, his voice heavy with controlled anger. It details plans to destroy burial grounds and ceremony sites that have been holy to my people since the beginning of time. It's a legal railroad survey, Webb insisted, authorized by the territorial government and approved by federal authorities. Authorized by whom? A new voice demanded from the cabin doorway. Everyone turned to see another figure entering, a white man in a military uniform that Samuel recognized as belonging to the Indian Agency. The newcomer was tall and weathered, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command. Colonel Morrison, Webb said, clearly surprised and not pleased by the new arrival. I wasn't expecting to see you here. I'm sure you weren't, Morrison replied dryly, especially since your activities here directly violate the agreements my agency has negotiated with the Apache tribes. Samuel felt pieces clicking into place. This had to be the newspaper editor's contact in the military, someone with authority to challenge Webb's claims of federal backing. Colonel Morrison is the territorial Indian agent, Ayanna explained quietly to Samuel. His wife is Apache from the Fort Apache Reservation. He's one of the few white officials who takes treaty obligations seriously. Morrison stepped further into the cabin, his gaze taking in the destroyed furniture and scattered papers. Marshal Webb, I received some very interesting information yesterday about unauthorized activities in this region. Information that suggested federal marshals were exceeding their authority in pursuit of private, rather than public interests. I'm conducting a legally authorized investigation, Webb replied stiffly. Are you? Let me see your warrant for searching this property. Webb produced the documents with obvious reluctance. Morrison examined them carefully, his expression growing increasingly skeptical. These warrants were issued for the arrest of a fugitive suspected of theft, Morrison said finally. They provide no authority for property searches or seizure of private papers, and they certainly don't authorize harassment of private citizens on their own land. The circumstances justified expanded investigation, Webb protested. Did they? Or did they justify a fishing expedition designed to cover up criminal conspiracy? Morrison's voice hardened. Because that's what this appears to be from my perspective. Samuel watched the confrontation with growing hope. Morrison clearly had the authority and knowledge to challenge Webb's claims, and his presence suggested that word of the conspiracy had already reached sympathetic officials. What criminal conspiracy? Webb demanded. Morrison smiled coldly. The conspiracy to defraud the Apache people of their treaty lands through falsified surveys and corrupt railroad deals. The conspiracy to conceal silver deposits on sacred land in order to facilitate illegal mining operations. The conspiracy to commit genocide through forced relocation and cultural destruction. Webb's face went white as Morrison listed the charges. You have no proof of any of that. Don't I? Morrison gestured toward Ayanna. I have testimony from a credible witness who overheard planning meetings. I have documentary evidence in the form of survey reports that conflict with established treaty boundaries. And I have a pattern of federal marshals acting outside their authority to suppress evidence of wrongdoing. The tactical situation had shifted dramatically in favor of Samuel and Ayanna. With Morrison's arrival, Webb could no longer claim unquestioned federal authority, and the presence of Apache warriors made any attempt at violence extremely dangerous. Furthermore, Morrison continued, I have instructions from the Department of Interior to investigate reports of corruption in railroad development projects. Your activities here, Marshal Webb, are now part of that investigation. Samuel felt a wave of relief so powerful it made his knees weak. The winter of hiding and planning had not been in vain. Somehow, word of the conspiracy had reached officials with the power to act against it. How did you know to come here? Samuel asked Morrison. Because 3 days ago, I received a visit from a very determined young Apache woman who had traveled more than 100 miles through dangerous country to bring me information about threats to her people. Morrison glanced at Ayanna with obvious respect. She told me about a white rancher who had risked everything to protect her and help expose the truth. Samuel stared at Ayanna in amazement. You went to Helena? When? How? 2 weeks ago, when you went to check the northern boundary fence, Ayanna replied. I followed the creek bed for miles to avoid Webb's patrols, then took the old mining trails through the mountains. It took me 4 days each way, but I had to reach someone who could help us before it was too late. Ayanna's eyes shone with tears. And I couldn't let you sacrifice your life for mine without fighting back. The realization hit Samuel like a physical blow. While he had been planning to travel to Helena himself, Ayanna had already made the journey, carrying the evidence and testimony needed to expose Webb's conspiracy. She had risked capture and death to ensure that the truth would be revealed. The game is over, Webb, Morrison said firmly. You and your men will surrender your weapons and submit to federal investigation. Any resistance will be treated as treason against the United States government. For a moment, Samuel thought Webb might try to fight his way out. The man's hand moved toward his gun and his companions tensed for action. But the sight of Apache warriors visible through every window apparently convinced him that resistance would be futile. This isn't finished, Webb said as he unbuckled his gun belt. There are powerful people behind this project, people with influence you can't imagine. Then they'll have their day in federal court, Morrison replied calmly, along with everyone else involved in this conspiracy. As Webb and his men were disarmed and restrained, Samuel felt the last of the winter's tension drain from his body. The danger that had hung over him and Ayanna for months was finally lifting, replaced by the possibility of justice and peace. Whitehawk approached Samuel, extending his hand in a gesture of respect. You have shown honor in protecting my niece. The Apache people do not forget such kindness. Samuel shook the chief's hand, feeling the strength and dignity of the man. I only did what anyone should have done. No, Whitehawk replied gravely. You did what few would have the courage to do. You chose truth over safety, justice over comfort. Such choices define a man's character. As the immediate crisis resolved, Samuel found himself alone with Ayanna for the first time since the confrontation began. She stood near the cabin window, looking out at the Apache warriors who had come to her aid. I thought I'd lost you, Samuel said quietly, when I realized you'd gone to Helena alone. I couldn't let you face the consequences of my problems, Ayanna replied. You'd already sacrificed so much for my safety. It wasn't sacrifice, it was... Samuel paused, searching for words to express feelings he hadn't fully acknowledged until now. It was the first time in years that I felt like I was doing something that mattered. Ayanna turned toward him, her eyes bright with unshed tears. What happens now? When this is over? When the trials are finished and the truth is exposed? I don't know, Samuel admitted, but I know what I hope happens. What's that? I hope you'll consider staying here. Not hiding this time, but living. Building something together. The confession hung in the air between them, vulnerable and honest. Samuel held his breath, waiting for her response. This ranch sits on land that may belong to my people, Ayanna said carefully. How can I stay in a place that represents the same kind of theft we're fighting against? Samuel had been thinking about that problem since Whitehawk's arrival. Then maybe we need to find a different solution, a way to honor both claims and build something new. Before Ayanna could respond, Whitehawk approached them. My niece, we must discuss what comes next. The winter camp waits for word of our success here. Samuel noticed how Ayana's hand moved protectively to her stomach during the conversation, a gesture he'd seen before but never fully understood. When she caught his questioning gaze, she gave him a small, knowing smile. "Uncle, there's something I need to tell you," Ayana said, her voice steady but nervous. "Samuel and I, we're going to have a child." The announcement struck Samuel like lightning. He stared at Ayana, understanding flooding through him. The signs had been there for weeks, subtle changes he had noticed but not fully comprehended. Now everything made sense. Her increased need for rest, her careful movements, the protective way she sometimes held her hand over her stomach. White Hawk's expression remained carefully neutral as he absorbed the news. "And the father?" Ayana looked directly at Samuel. "The father is the man who saved my life and protected me through the winter. The man who risked everything to help my people." Samuel felt his world shift on its axis. He was going to be a father again, something he had thought impossible after losing Thomas. The prospect filled him with equal parts joy and terror. "This changes things," White Hawk said thoughtfully. "A child born of Apache and white parents belongs to both peoples. Such a child could bridge the gap between our worlds." "If both worlds will accept such a bridge," Ayana replied. Samuel found his voice finally. "They'll have to, because I intend to be part of this child's life, whatever it takes." White Hawk studied Samuel with the intensity of a man evaluating character and commitment. "Gushao, you understand what you're saying? You would take an Apache woman as wife? Raise a mixed-blood child in a world that despises such unions?" "Yes," Samuel replied without hesitation. "If she'll have me." Ayana's tears finally spilled over, running down her cheeks as she smiled. "Yes, Samuel Garrett, I'll have you." The kiss they shared was witnessed by Apache warriors and federal officials alike, a symbol of possibility in a world too often divided by fear and hatred. As they held each other, Samuel felt the future opening before them like spring arriving in Montana territory. Uncertain, challenging, but full of promise. Colonel Morrison approached them as they separated. "I hate to interrupt, but we need to discuss practical matters. This conspiracy reaches far beyond Webb and his immediate associates. The trials and investigations will take months, possibly years." "What do you need from us?" Samuel asked. "Testimony, primarily. Both of your accounts will be crucial in building cases against the railroad executives and government officials involved in the fraud." Morrison paused. "I should warn you that testifying will make you targets for retaliation. There's a great deal of money involved in this scheme." "We understand the risks," Ayana replied firmly, "but the truth has to be told." "Good, because there's something else you should know." Morrison smiled. "The Department of Interior has decided to investigate all railroad surveys in this territory. If we find evidence of fraud or treaty violations, the entire development project could be suspended or canceled." Samuel felt a surge of hope. What would that mean for the Apache lands? It would mean protection, at least temporarily, and it would provide time to negotiate new agreements that respect tribal rights and sacred sites. White Hawk nodded approvingly. "This is what we hoped for when we agreed to work with your government. Justice instead of force, cooperation instead of conquest." As the day wore on, details were arranged and plans were made. Webb and his men were taken into federal custody, while Morrison began the process of documenting evidence and preparing for the legal battles ahead. White Hawk and his warriors prepared to return to the winter camp with news of their success. But before the Apache delegation departed, White Hawk made a formal announcement that surprised everyone present. "There is something else you must know about my niece," White Hawk said solemnly, his voice carrying the weight of ancient authority. "Ayana is not just any Apache woman. She is the granddaughter of Chief Cochise himself, through her grandmother's line. Her exile was not punishment, it was protection." Webb's face went ashen. "Cochise's bloodline? That's impossible." "The sacred silver beneath our winter grounds was placed under her family's protection generations ago," White Hawk continued. "As the last of Cochise's female descendants, Ayana holds the hereditary right to speak for the Apache Nation in matters concerning our most sacred places. Your railroad survey is not just theft, it is an act of war against Apache royalty." Samuel listened with growing amazement as Whitehawk continued. That union produced children who walked between both worlds, including the woman who became Ayanna's grandmother. This ranch doesn't represent theft, Samuel Garrett. It represents homecoming. The revelation reframed everything Samuel thought he knew about his property and his relationship with Ayanna. They weren't just two people who had found each other by chance. They were part of a pattern that reached back generations, a continuing story of connection across cultural divides. The Apache Nation recognizes your claim to this land, Whitehawk declared formally. But we also claim you as family. You and your children will always have a place among us. As evening approached and the various parties prepared to depart, Samuel and Ayanna found themselves alone on the cabin porch, watching the sun set over the mountains that had sheltered them through their long winter together. "Do you think it will work?" Ayanna asked, her hand resting on her still flat stomach. "Building a life that honors both our peoples?" "I think we have to try," Samuel replied, wrapping his arm around her shoulders. "For our child, if for no other reason. And for all the children who come after. Mixed blood children who need to see that they belong somewhere in this world." Samuel nodded, understanding the larger significance of what they were attempting. Their marriage and family would be more than personal choices. They would be the statements about the possibility of unity in a divided world. Over the following weeks, Samuel and Ayanna settled into a new routine. The cabin that had once sheltered secrets now buzzed with activity as federal investigators came and went, documenting evidence and taking statements. Samuel found himself protective of Ayanna's growing condition, insisting she rest while he dealt with the endless questions about Webb's activities. As spring settled into summer, their testimony proved crucial in building cases against Webb's conspirators to build the case against Webb and his conspirators. The railroad company's executives were arrested, their mining claims were voided, and the Apache winter grounds were officially protected under federal treaty law. Ayanna's pregnancy progressed smoothly, and with each passing day, Samuel marveled at the new life growing within her. Not just their child, but the promise of a future where two peoples could truly become one. When their son kicked for the first time, Samuel felt Thomas's spirit finally at peace, knowing that the Garrett legacy would continue in a child who belonged to both worlds. 6 months later, as autumn painted the Montana landscape in shades of gold and crimson, Samuel and Ayanna were married in a ceremony that honored both Apache and white traditions. Colonel Morrison officiated, while Whitehawk provided blessings according to tribal custom. The wedding guests included federal officials, neighboring ranchers, and Apache families who had traveled hundreds of miles to witness the union. Webb's trial had concluded with convictions on multiple federal charges, and the railroad conspiracy had been exposed in newspapers throughout the territory. The investigation had reached all the way to Washington, resulting in new policies to protect tribal lands from fraudulent development schemes. But for Samuel and Ayanna, the most important victory was simpler and more personal. They had found each other in a winter storm, had protected each other through danger and uncertainty, and had built something lasting from the ashes of their separate tragedies. When their son was born on a warm April morning, Samuel held the tiny, perfect child with trembling hands. The boy had Ayanna's dark hair and Samuel's strong jawline, but it was his eyes that told the story. Bright, alert, and seeming to hold the wisdom of both his peoples. "Thomas Whitehawk Garrett," Samuel whispered, the name carrying the weight of memory, hope, and promise. As he looked into his son's face, he saw not just his own future, but the bridge between two worlds that this child would become, honoring the memory of Samuel's lost child and the Apache chief who had helped save their lives. The boy would grow up knowing both languages and both traditions, a living bridge between peoples who had too often seen each other as enemies. And in the cabin that Samuel had built with his own hands, where he had once mourned alone and Ayanna had once hidden in fear, 3 generations would gather around the fire to share stories, to pass down wisdom, and to prove that love could indeed conquer the divisions that seemed to separate one people from another. The winter storm that had brought them together was long past, but its promise remained that even in the darkest and coldest times, unexpected warmth could be found, unexpected shelter could be given, and unexpected love could bloom between hearts brave enough to trust in tomorrow.